Imagine two countries that have not spoken to each other for nearly 20 years. Two countries that severed diplomatic relations after one of the most tense crises of the Cold War. Two countries where the mere mention of the other's name was enough to ignite a political argument, a street protest, an inflamed speech in parliament. Now imagine those two countries on a pitch, in a stadium, at a World Cup, with the entire world watching. And imagine that, before the ball even rolled, the players of one of those countries walked to the center of the grass and handed white flowers to the players of the other. White flowers. At a football match. Between two historical enemies. If someone had written that script as science fiction, it would have been considered too naive to be taken seriously. And yet it happened. In Lyon, in June 1998, the United States cut diplomatic relations with Iran in 1980. And from that moment, the two countries existed in a permanent state of cold hostility, where every gesture from the other side was interpreted as a threat, where every statement was analyzed as a provocation, where the simple act of talking already required political justification before the public opinion of each side. For nearly 20 years, an American diplomat and an Iranian diplomat could not be in the same room without it becoming a geopolitical event. And then FIFA placed the two countries in the same group at the 1998 World Cup. Group F: France, Denmark, Saudi Arabia, the United States, and Iran. The draw was conducted with the clinical coldness that World Cup draws usually have, but when the names of the United States and Iran appeared in the same group, the room did not react with the clinical coldness of a sporting event. It reacted with the tremor of someone who has just realized that something far greater than football was about to happen. Political journalists who had never covered football began requesting credentials for the match. International policy analysts started monitoring the two government statements about the game. And within both countries, the reaction to the draw was as intense as any diplomatic news could have been. In Iran, the political context had changed significantly by the time of the draw. Mohammad Khatami had been elected president in 1997 on a reformist platform that proposed, among other things, an opening toward dialogue with the West. Khatami was a moderate cleric who had surprised the world by proposing, in a CNN interview in January 1998, a cultural exchange with the United States, citing sport specifically as a possible bridge between the two peoples. Khatami's interview had been seen as a historic gesture of openness, and now fate had created the perfect opportunity for that gesture to become something concrete, a football match at a World Cup. On the American side, the Clinton administration was navigating delicate waters. There was interest in resuming some kind of contact with Khatami's moderate Iran, but any overly obvious signal of rapprochement would be politically costly inside the United States, where the memory of the embassy siege was still a raw wound for millions of American families. Football offered a way to do what formal diplomacy still could not do. Place the two countries in the same space and let the cameras of the entire world record what happened. The Iranian squad arrived at the 1998 World Cup in a completely different position from the Americans. Football in Iran had exploded in popularity throughout the 90s, and the national team had qualified for that tournament in dramatic fashion, in a decisive match against Australia that had filled the streets of Tehran with celebrations the government itself tried but failed to contain. For Iranians, the 1998 World Cup was a national event of almost religious proportions. And playing against the United States was, for that generation of players and supporters, an occasion that mixed football with national identity in a way that few matches in history have managed to achieve. The American team, for its part, was technically inferior to Iran in that tournament. The United States had hosted the previous World Cup in 1994, and the sport had grown in the country, but the national team was still a work in progress compared to the established powers of world football. Coach Steve Sampson had called up a group of professional players from European and American leagues, and the realistic expectation was that the United States would not advance past the group stage. The match against Iran was, in theory, one more test for a developing squad rather than a confrontation between equals. But nothing in that game followed the expected script. Not in sporting terms, not in political terms, and not in human terms. In the days leading up to the match, something extraordinary began happening on the margins of the sporting event. Representatives of the two football federations began meeting to discuss not just the logistics of the game, but the tone it should carry. There was a shared awareness that this match was bigger than a World Cup fixture. It was an opportunity. And wasting an opportunity like that, letting the political weight turn 90 minutes of football into yet another chapter in a Cold War that nobody wanted anymore, would be a mistake that history would not easily forgive. And then the Iranian players decided to do something that no diplomatic protocol had suggested, that no government had ordered, that no sporting regulation had anticipated. They decided on their own, as players, as human beings going to meet other human beings on a football pitch, to hand white flowers to their American opponents before the match. White roses, the universal symbol of peace. The simplest and most powerful gesture those players could have made. When the Iranian squad walked toward the center of the pitch at the Stade de Guerlain in Lyon, and the players began distributing the flowers, the television cameras of the entire world did not know where to look first. The American players, who had clearly not expected that gesture, reacted with a mixture of surprise and emotion that was captured on every one of their faces. There was no coldness. There was no indifference. There was something that transcended sport, and that both groups of players recognized at the same moment, that they were part of something that went far beyond any World Cup. The two squads posed together for a photograph before the match. Not the cold, distant protocol photo that opponents usually take at a World Cup game. A real photograph, with players who looked at each other, who smiled, who shared the space with a genuine generosity that no communications advisor had scripted. And when the ball finally rolled, the game that followed was played with the intensity that any World Cup demands, but without the hostility that the history of the two countries might have placed on the pitch. Iran won 2-1. Goals from Estelai and Modavikia, with McBride pulling one back for the Americans. The Iranian team celebrated with an intensity that revealed what that victory meant for a country that had waited 20 years for a moment like this. The Iranian players ran onto the pitch, removed their boots, held up the national flag. Some wept. And the images of those celebrations were broadcast live to millions of Iranians watching from the other side of the world, in Tehran, in Isfahan, in Shiraz, in cities where the streets had been taken over by supporters following the game on large screens and on television sets placed in apartment windows. But what happened after the final whistle was as important as what had happened before it. The American players did not leave the pitch with the expression of those who had been humiliated by an enemy. They left with the expression of those who had lost a football match. And the Iranian players, rather than letting the victory become a political statement, a speech about the superiority of one country over another, celebrated with the dignity of those who understand that what had happened on that pitch was bigger than any scoreline could capture. Iranian coach Jalal Talibai gave a post-match press conference in which he spoke about football and about respect with a clarity that would have put many professional diplomats to shame. American goalkeeper Casey Keller, who had made several fine saves during the match, praised the Iranian squad without reservation. And Brian McBride, who had scored the American goal, said in an interview that he hoped that game would be remembered not for the victory or the defeat, but for what had happened before it began. The white flowers. The following day, newspapers around the world published photographs of that moment. Not photographs of the goals. Not photographs of the celebrations. Photographs of the flowers. Publications that had never given space to football dedicated full pages to a World Cup match because that match had done something that decades of formal diplomacy had not managed to do. It had placed Americans and Iranians in the same space and had shown the world that the two peoples, when separated from their governments and their rhetoric and their histories of hurt and distrust, were capable of looking at each other as human beings. There was no political reconciliation after that match. The United States and Iran continued with their tensions, continued without formal diplomatic relations, continued existing in a state of mutual distrust that no football match would be naive enough to completely undo. But something had changed. Something subtle, something that appeared in no official document, that no head of state had signed, but that millions of people in two countries had felt at the same time on that June day in 1998. The perception that the other side was also human. That is the rarest and most underestimated power of football. Not the power to unite nations, which is a claim too large to always be true, but the power to create, for 90 minutes, a space where the humanity of both sides of any conflict becomes visible at the same time. And when that happens, when two squads representing two enemy countries manage to greet each other with white flowers in the center of a pitch before competing at a World Cup, football becomes something that goes far beyond sport. 26 years after that match, the tension between the United States and Iran continues. The world remains complex, conflicts continue to exist, and diplomacy continues to struggle to find paths where politics fails. But those white flowers still exist. They are in the photographs. They are in the archives. They live in the memory of everyone who watched. And they exist as proof that there was a day, in a stadium in Lyon, on an afternoon in June 1998, when two historical enemies looked at each other and chose, for a moment, to be only football players. And that, in the world we live in, is more revolutionary than any goal could ever be. If you made it this far, tell me in the comments what you thought of this story. It is one of the ones that moves me most every time I tell it, because it mixes football with politics and humanity in a way that very few moments in history manage to achieve. Tell me also which city and country you are watching from, because this channel receives people from every corner of the world and I am genuinely curious to know where each of you comes from. Hit the like button if you made it to the end, because it helps the channel keep growing and bringing stories like this one. And if you are not yet subscribed, subscribe now, because there is a lot more great content on the way. Oh, and before I close, while researching the story I came across something very special connected to the world of classic football and the nostalgia of that era that you will want to discover. I will not reveal it here, but the link is in the first pinned comment below the video. Well worth checking out, no strings attached, just for those who love this universe. And hold on to this before you go. What you just watched is only one more of the stories that football keeps and that the world does not tell as often as it should. There is much more coming, stories even more surprising, even more human, even harder to believe. Soon, right here, on this channel. You will not want to miss them.